Welcome to the session on culture as a public good. Such an honour to be here on the lands of the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri people on their unceded land. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. My name's Esther Anatolitis. I am editor of Meanjin, honorary associate professor at RMIT School of Art, a board member of the National Gallery of Australia, co-chair of the Australian Republic movement. As you can see, there's many hats that bring us all together here. But for 2 decades, I've also run arts and media organisations, national peak and industry bodies and advocacy consortia with a very strong focus on culture as a public good. So I am so delighted to get to be here, and in particular here with Justin O'Connor, Jacqueline Lowe, Matthew Trinker and Kim Williams, who I will introduce one by one as we go. We're going to hear from them each in turn and then we'll have some questions. And welcome to everyone who is joining us online. If you're joining online, please just add your questions to the chat at any time, as soon as it pops into your mind, and then we can turn to them later. It's been great hearing from everyone online as well as everyone who is here in the space. So, culture as a public good. The blurb says to us, culture has long been integral to national community. Well, I guess it has, hasn't it? I mean, in the sense that culture is everything we practice and everything we realise when we don't realise we're practising it. Although, as Nick Horne has reminded us earlier, there's no sense of a national culture, there's no sense of a manufactured self-consciousness, and we've had some great problematisations of that notion of a national or a singular culture across these last couple of days. So culture has long been integral to national community, and this relationship was being reshaped and reinvigorated at the time Donald Horne wrote The Lucky Country. Donald Horne celebrated the culture and lifestyle of ordinary Australians while bemoaning the quality of Australia's elite. Now, I've always read The Lucky Country as being a third in a great Australian trilogy. A.A. Phillips's The Cultural Cringe, published in Meanjin summer 1950, which Frank and I will be talking about after this. Of course, Robin Boyd's The Australian Ugliness in 1960, and then, of course, The Lucky Country in 1964, which really does seem to me, I mean, each one of those, as Ryan Kopp put it yesterday, have got one of those key phrases that spark political action. He described it as new frameworks for political action. But of course, 1964 was also the year that my parents migrated to Australia. Yes, it's been fascinating, not just with the slowest assimilators concept, but reading back as someone who was the first to champion publicly that notion of a future Australian Republic, I was quite surprised that Horne was confused as to why Greek Australians might be at the time protesting monarchy. The 1970s and 80s, our blurb continues, witnessed greater investment in the cultural domains, seeing the rise of commercial sport as spectacle and the lavish, colourful and contested Bicentenary of 1988. And of course, as we've discussed these last couple of days, that colourful and contested does mean elite, whitewashed, blind to First Nations. Shino Korinsky mentioned yesterday that sense of 1988 as being a flashpoint for a lot of the issues that we're now discussing today. The present century, arguably, our blurb continues, has seen a faltering of the idea of culture as a basis for national identity, as well as less willingness on the part of government to fund it. And we've all seen the roller coaster. I would love to have seen, speaking of Creative Australia and the Australia Council, that body funding the humanities. But certainly currently funding for the arts and culture is static, and it's falling at state and many local levels. How did culture lose some of this purchase as a public good? And how has the idea that it is an elite project been so easily politicised to fight culture wars, or as Jacqueline said yesterday, the smells and the bills of the culture war? This session will explore whether the project of a national culture is still either possible or desirable, and what role a renovated and inclusive concept of culture might play in Australia's future. And of course, for culture to remain integral, it must be named, it must be defined, it must be understood, it must, when it's under attack, it must be called out. So let's meet our friends one by one in turn. We're going to start with Justin O'Connor. Justin is Professor of Cultural Economy at the University of South Australia, which has recently merged into form... No, forget that. No, we'll edit that bit out. And visiting professor at the School of Cultural Management at Shanghai Jiaotong University. Between 2012 and 2018, he was a member of the UNESCO expert facility supporting the 2005 Convention on the Protection and Promotion of Cultural Diversity. He's currently working with the Reset Collective, and he's going to examine what we mean by a public good and how we can reassert culture as an essential element of the public policy, alongside health, education, social services and basic infrastructure. Please welcome Professor Justin O'Connor.
Yeah, I just wrote a book called Culture is Not an Industry, which argues that culture is not an industry. Culture has many industries, some of them massive global corporations, but culture itself is not an industry. Parts of the book, first chapter of the book, talks about the idea of cultural and creative industries, which I think has been an absolute disaster for thinking about art and culture in this country. It failed as an advocacy tool. Just go and have a look at the funding levels in this country and actually elsewhere in Europe and the UK. The actual, the thrusting sector that was going to change our lives, the creative sector, creative industries, actually it's got a lower growth than the rest of the employment in Australia. It's very small, it's like 2%, 3% if you stretch the statistics. And basically it's full of people who are lower paid, more precarious, overeducated and underproductive. So it's failed. But more importantly for me, it's hollowed out our understanding of culture, making those ever more baroque arguments that culture is some kind of industry. It's hollowed out our real sense of what art and culture are for. And it needs a radical reappraisal. My proposition is that culture is a public good, that it needs to be moved to a different position in public policy alongside health, education, social services and essential infrastructure. So culture as a public good, founded on three broad propositions or pillars, if you like. First of all, rights. And of course, there's the UN Declaration on Human Rights, 27.1. Everyone has the right to freely participate in the cultural life of the community, to enjoy the arts and share in scientific advancement and its benefits. Pretty basic. I like T.H. Marshall's definition of social citizenship just a few years after, where he says, it's social citizenship from granting the right to a modicum of economic welfare and security, to the right to share to the full in the social heritage and to live the life of a civilised being according to the standards prevailing in that society. Well, I would sign up for that. So that's the cultural rights sorted. But second of all, you need resources. You need resources and capabilities in the Amartya Sen sense of that to participate in culture, and that involves education in its widest possible sense, accessible spaces, places, other things which I'll detail a bit later. You need a whole range of things to participate in culture. And you also need a functioning welfare state. Third, to participate in the cultural life of the community, there actually needs to be a cultural life. And this is what most concerns me. Now, in my book, I look towards the idea of the foundational economy. It's a group of people coming out of Manchester. It's now kind of a more global than that. A kind of standard heterodox economics approach, rethinking economics beyond GDP growth, focusing on the social foundations of, what makes it possible to live together as a society, or the kind of society we might want. And their arguments are quite simple. Basic arguments for a decent society: you need material infrastructure, roads, fibre optics, whatever. You need services, health, education, social services, public administration, etc. Plus a thriving, what they call an everyday local economy. The small-scale cafes, garages, nail bars, hairdressers, all those kind of things that exist. And actually, the fully transactional, capitalist, red in tooth and claw economy is a small part of what we call the economy, actually. And I wanted to say this also importantly. I am not saying that there are no economics in culture, which I often get called out on that. I'm not saying that. In fact, if we look actually at health, social services, education, infrastructure, these are huge economics. They employ loads of people. There's contracts and wages and etc. So when I say to align culture with public policy, it's not to deny any kind of economic basis for that. I'll come back to some of that. But I would say that in terms of the foundational economy, something like between 60 and 70% of all employment across Australia, and I've done the statistics, is in the infrastructures, social services and small-scale local economy. It goes up to 75 in some rural areas. So this is a big thing. But where's culture in all this? So there's a lot of these kind of heterodox economics we hear about. Where's culture in this? And I really wanted to try and do this in the book. So what's clear to me, and it's clear to many people, as we all know, that not only are these services, these infrastructures, the services, and the everyday economies being eroded, but there's a growing sense that the social infrastructure itself, what Graham Turner yesterday called the civil society and its complex local embedment, if you like, this cultural infrastructure has been seriously eroded. We've got the erosion of all sorts of associations around work, unions and workplace associations, but other things as well. And this has been going on for a long time, and well before we got to algorithms and things. Robert Putnam's book, Bowling Alone, written in the early 90s, and we stretch all the way through their recent article called it From Bowling Alone to Posting Alone, to show that actually what we're experiencing now in social media, it has long roots outside of social media. And of course, we all know about the hollowing out of democracy and the hyper politics, the hyper-polarization that's gone with it. So there's this sense that our social infrastructure is eroded. And the erosion of the cultural infrastructure is part of that. So what do I mean by that cultural infrastructure? It's not physical spaces. It's not millions and millions of dollars poured into big museums, which is how it's often understood. It is that as well, but smaller scale spaces. It's about education, training. It's about preserving, embedding, exhibiting, performing institutions. It's about accessible public spaces, open public media, public services, available grants, the full legal and material means to allow a participation in culture. This is the cultural infrastructure that it weaves in and out of what we might more formally call the social infrastructure. It's part of our communities, it's part of what keeps us together. I always think if we began to provide these resources, as we could, I mean, let's not kid ourselves, we could afford a cultural infrastructure easily, with 1% of an Auscas budget for a start, or the subsidy to fossil fuels. It's easy to spend this. We've decided we don't want to do it. But if we did do this, what kind of huge employment boost would it be? Now, I could talk about that, but I don't want to, because that's not my main argument for culture. Because what we should be arguing for is we need to put in place the resources, the wide range of resources necessary for the right to a full participation in culture. And it's not just about the state funding, but it's also about this, what I call this everyday economy of culture, i.e., this everyday economy of culture is not the market, whatever that is. It's this, we all know what it is. It's this mishmash of gift economies, sacrificial labour, sole traders, small businesses, real and de facto co-ops, hand-to-mouth, gig economy, precarious workers, you know, hanging on by their fingernails kind of live music venues. This whole mix of stuff that actually makes cities worth living in. It's why we come to many of these cities, because of these economies. This is where the rat bags are, if you like. This is where innovation happens. It's where we support this complicated aesthetic and ethical communities of practice. These are cultural economies, the everyday economies. These too are under threat, as we all know. So both the state-funded cultural sector and also everyday local benefit, they both produce, they thrive on and need, and they also produce public goods. But first of all, I want to ask what actually is a public good? And I was always interested by Gough Whitland's, you know, great opening up of arts funding. And, you know, I mean, you all know this anyway, but I like the story. He wrote to the Industrial Assistance Commission, the Productivity Commission, as it was to be, saying, well, I've just started all these great, fantastic things. Can you give me a rationale? And they went, no, we can't, actually. And he says, they said, the performing arts provide psychological, emotional, or intellectual stimulation and other forms of personal satisfaction to individuals. However, these do not of themselves justify public assistance. So it appears self-evident, they said, that once government assistance can be claimed for entertainment, the drain on resources would be endless. And this, I think this is almost undermined Labour's cultural policy for the last 30 years. Cultural creative industries is one solution to this, but it's a slow leak. It's a slow leak that somehow there's a lack of legitimacy here. And of course, this is where public goods come in again. So economists, actually their definition, neoclassical economists, their definition of cultural goods is, public goods is those which basically are non-excludable. Effectively, you can't charge for it. You can't exclude people from them. Therefore, you can't make them pay for it. And of course, so therefore the state somehow has to step in and do this. And this is an extremely negative definition of public goods, and many people don't like the word because of that negative. There's been a lot of writing recently about infrastructure and the need for infrastructure, and a kind of a reorientation around that. And infrastructure is now being presented as something actually much more positive than that. It's all the things we don't need to think about, but it needs to be taken care of. They're public goods. They're non-excludable. You can't charge for them, or not too much, not for the full cost. But they're positively presented because collective consumption is part of its value. Collective consumption is the aim is to add as many people as possible. It's impossible to fully guess what new activities they stimulate, what it creates. It's a kind of faith in the future, kind of trust in the fact that these sunk costs will provide something for now and intergenerational in the future. And this kind of future trust is impossible for economists to calculate. And of course, this idea of a positive public good, something that is collective in its production and consumption, is really important. It draws Justin, an older tradition.
Justin, 3 minutes.
Sorry?
3 minutes.
Right, yes. It's really important. Goes back to other traditions. You know, you think of socialism, social democracy, social liberalism, all these kind of things, and of course thinking about classical civilization, and thinking about yesterday's session around looking at how Aboriginal ways of making decisions expands our concept of democracy, something an offer that we turned down. So. I suppose I make the argument here that we've got these public goods here that we should devalue. They're collective in nature. They should be presented in that, and that they should be applied to the everyday cultural sector, the market sector, the ones that's not directly supplied by the state. And because although they're a commercial sector in many different ways, they themselves are part of a public conversation. The value that they create derives from previous conversations and adds to that conversations. So we get this idea that we need to find ways to support the free market sector. It's not really a free market, but this complex sector. And I think we've lost the ability to do that. We've lost the capacity in the will to do that, and even the language to do that. But we really need to do it because it's under threat, as we all know. 6 of the 10 largest corporations on the planet deal in culture. You know, Meta, I can't remember, you know, the NVIDIA. 6 of the 10 largest on the planet deal in some way with culture. They call themselves tech. And they are eating culture alive. Think only of what's happening to AI, where what Marx called the general intellect is now owned by large language learning models. So the public goods are actually facing now some very severe public bads. And I think it's time for us to really start to address how do we provide a proper cultural infrastructure, if you like, cultural foundations. How do we make sure that the games, the videos, the TVs, the festivals, the live music venues, the theatre, all those kind of things that we take for granted, how can they continue to exist? Yes, outside the state. They depend on certain forms of states, but how can they continue outside of there? And that's about, you know, what Mariana Mazzucato calls market tilting in that way. And so, yeah, so I was trying to do that. So my final line really is that, you know, we no longer have the language to do this, we don't have the capacity to do this, and we need to develop it very quickly. And as I say, the starting ground is to understand and assert that culture is a public good and demands public attention. So we need to wake up, and you know, my book of that period, probably 3 years before The Lucky Country, but, you know, it's not so much The Lucky Country, but really Waking Fright. You know, so there we go.
Wow, thank you, Justin. That was absolutely the rousing start to this session that we needed. I'm now, my mind's abuzz with both social citizenship but also the rat bags of innovation. These are roles to which we must aspire. Now, let's meet Professor Jacqueline Lowe. Jacqueline is Director of the new Indo-Pacific Research Centre at Murdoch University. She's also Honorary Professor at the ANU, an internationally recognised humanities scholar and pioneer of Asian Australian studies. Her work on multiculturalism, diaspora and cross-cultural studies has influenced academic and policy sectors in Europe, Asia and the USA. And Professor Lowe is going to look beyond that national culture, culture wars tension and towards culture for an inclusive, increasingly multicultural future. Please welcome Professor Lowe.
Hi everyone. I've spent most of my professional life in Canberra and only just recently returned home to Perth, so I want to especially acknowledge my great debt to the Ngunnawal elders and the community who have taught me so much about country. Got a bit, it's great actually, Justin, thank you for finishing off in terms of talking about our need for finding new languages, and I think I'm riffing off a little bit of what you're trying to say, in fact, in terms of new ways for us to talk about living interculturally. So others have, I think we've had a great start to the debate about culture. I don't want to talk too much about what Horne would say about what is Australian culture now, but I do wonder what he would say about how we're doing culture, how we're making culture, that practice of culture making. And in particular, I hope my talk will give you some thought around that tension between the representational and representative. And I'll be using performance making as an example of this practice within a multicultural post-colonial context. Intercultural theatre practice is generally understood as this broad field of exchange, negotiation and engagement between cultural traditions and communities. And in the world of performance making, the intercultural turn occurred around about the 80s and 90s, exemplified by the works of people like Peter Brook, Ariane Mnouchkine, and Ong Keng Seng. very much characterized, and I've got some quotes here, but it's really about kind of first world capital and brain power raiding third world raw materials, cultural materials. This kind of intercultural theatre practice has been rightly criticised as colonialist and orientalist by many, and I've got colleagues in the room and online who've contributed to this critique over many years now. And one would hope that, in the 21st century, we would not be seeing such works on the main stage, in mainstream multicultural Australia, and especially not on platforms supported by public monies. But here's a recent example. The Nightingale was the centrepiece of this year's Adelaide Festival, and what you saw was the video of an earlier Canadian production that was used on the festival website. Lepage is a superstar theatre director, well known for his spectacles, but he has also drawn criticisms for his use in other productions of using, for example, slave songs without African American performers on stage. The Taiwanese, the Nightingale uses Taiwanese puppetry and Vietnamese water puppetry as well, without any performers or people working behind the scenes from those countries in the production. And of course, there's that delightful yellow facing. The puppeteers and the singers with full makeup, and in case you've missed that one, and yes, that is me. So, actually, I'll go back over here. So, the production reflects Horne's critique, or what he calls, that aristocratic approach to Asia. And this refers not just to Asia out there, but Asia within here. I was outraged and led a bit of a campaign of protests in late 2023 when this production was first announced, which is why you see me reflected in the video and the photo from the website. Those, as part of that protest and campaign, which was successful, those images have now been conveniently edited out of the festival website. So if you go searching for it, you won't see it anymore. You'll see other bits of it, but this is all the evidence I have. When the production premiered in March, most of the more outrageous yellow-face makeup and dress had been expunged. But the central issue about raiding the global south for raw materials without adequate recognition, the practice of interculturalism I talked about, was never actually addressed by the festival. So on the representational front, it appeared better. No more yellow facing. And the dress-up is gone. But what was not so visible in terms of representative rights was never actually addressed. The performing traditions from Asia were still being exploited as spectacle, with no Asian performers on stage or backstage, for that matter. So I won a small battle against yellow facing, but I doubt I made much more of a dent than a dent in the festival or Mackenzie or Lepage's celebrity. But maybe the dent is enough to pave the way for more cracks in the future if we all demand better accountability from our public institutions and challenge the foundations of whose good is being served when we talk about the public good. So that's a kind of a hegemonic version of interculturalism. But there have been new forms of interculturalism that have been developed more recently that are rhizomatic, minoritarian and intersectional, and it doesn't subscribe to that west-rest binary. And these have tended to be focusing on histories, projects that focus on histories arising from minoritarian practices, often collaborative and from a bottoms-up kind of interculturalism. The Broome-based theatre company or performance company Marugeku exemplifies this new kind of interculturalism with a specific focus on Indigenous governed practices that take place on the shifting grounds of cultural interaction, invoking histories of contact in contested sites. Indigenous governed interculturalism described here responds directly to land and its First Peoples' priorities and policies and politics. I've been privileged to work with Marugeku's co-directors, Dahlia Pigram and Rachel Swain, for many years now, and we recently wrote an essay on this topic. And so the rest of my talk borrows from this publication with their permission. Marugeku's 30-year-plus practice has evolved and refined, and it's taken this long, really, to boil down and to be able to articulate in very specific ways the 4 relational frameworks that I've got up here on the slide that define and guide their work. I won't go into great detail in the interest of time, and I think you can probably guess at some of what the frameworks are about. But very briefly, dance conducted in country is about protocol, understanding what being on country means in terms of guiding behaviours. And host country relationships is all about actually understanding where we're coming from, whether we are as guests and how we're engaging with First Nations. It's about our responsibility. And Everyone Has a Story is really about making the unknown known, the untold told, but also that it's not about, in performance terms, it's not about teaching an Indigenous style of dance, for example. It's actually very much about how one's own history informs that vocabulary, and I'll come back to that shortly. Framework 4, I do want to talk a little bit more about. We haven't talked a lot about Makarrata, I think, even yesterday, about what it means. As Dahlia Pigram explains, Makarrata's relationships, exchange and disputes between Indigenous nations have always been negotiated in large part through performance and ceremony. The Yolngu described the negotiated process to settle disputes as Makarrata is a framework for deep listening and hearing, a considered space for addressing trauma, wrongdoings, and for clearing pathways to move forward. The failure of the referendum to deliver what would have been a critical step towards conciliation highlights the significant work that is required for Makarrata in the form of meeting, truth-telling, and negotiating. The referendum has undoubtedly deepened the rift between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australia, so it's more important than ever to reset relationship. So Marugeku's 4th framework creates this opportunity to come together after a struggle in a state of productive instability through a performative encounter of relational exchanges that is the accumulation of the 4 intercultural frameworks. Like a Makarrata, Marugeku's work is a respectful acknowledgement of differences and requires a preparedness of all parties to both speak and listen. Jurungunganga, or straight talking, first premiered in 2021, not 2012, sorry about that, and has been touring nationally and internationally. Jurungunganga delves into Australia's deeply rooted fear of the other as it is manifest in different forms of incarceration, as this modus operandi for containing and neutralising difference and threats, perceived threats. It examines the common thread that connects outrageous levels of Indigenous incarceration, imprisonment in Australia, to the government's indefinite detention of asylum seekers. This focus on intersectionality also afforded the company the opportunity to extend its intercultural processes to build allied knowledges, resistance and survivance across Indigenous and refugee subjectivities and experiences. The production is performed by a cast that reflects the intersectional character of the project. First Nations and settler dancers of Palestinian, Filipino, Philippines and English-Irish heritage. Company members and their families have lived experiences of displacement, exile, incarceration, and settler privilege, all of which have informed their improvisational responses to the source text, including the Four Corners expose on the Dondell Detention Centre and Burroughs Buchani's No Friend But the Mountains. I'll just give you a very, very quick snapshot of this. In the prison scene, Farah Shaheen and Issa El-Assad dance a defiant fusion of Palestinian debke and house dance that matches the fury of Wiranjari dancer Chandler Connor. And so what you find in this form of interculturalism is that the performers don't display reified signs of exotic difference. It's none of that puppetry. The performance vocabulary, like the stories, come from deeply lived experiences. Marugeku enables artists to be empowered to express their complex experiences of shifting identities through creative assertions of imagination, political agency, cultural expression, and personal sharing. This methodology enacts a kind of Makarata ceremony. In rehearsing and staging platforms for meeting each other, echoing the Uluru statement, through trans-indigenous and intercultural exchange, the project needed to progress with good lian. According to Dahlia, in Yawuru, lian can mean well-being, good spirit, feeling, or intuition. In Marugeku's practice, the company is conscious of applying the tools of the performing arts to make such processes of Makarata visible for its diverse audiences who respond to their work from very different experiences and worldviews. So this raises the question of how we see something that we might not fully understand and still be called to act. Western epistemology assumes that rational decision-making is based on informed facts, benefits, risk assessment, and the analysis of potential outcomes. It assumes that the world is explicable and explainable to everyone. Acknowledging that one does not know and perhaps cannot know might be the first step towards humility and progress towards a national Makarata. Accessing and awakening lian sometimes requires activating an experience of not knowing or a desire to know or feel differently. After the referendum, we really need to clear lian. We need to learn from Indigenous and settler arts practitioners like Dahlia and Rachel, and so many of the speakers over the last couple of days in terms of what we've all learned and understood by it. But more than that, we do need, I think, Makarata, and what I've learned from Marugeku is that we need to acknowledge First Nation cultural authority and trust in their ability to create space and hold space, that relational space that will enable us to continue this very contested, very difficult conversation that we need to have. The humanities has a huge role to play in it, as do the arts as well. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Jacqueline. What a powerful positioning of that move from understanding through a performance vocabulary what our call to action needs to be. It's so much to think about in that session. I hope everyone's starting to list your questions. Now, let me introduce Dr. Matthew Trinker, Professor of Museum Practice at the Australian National University and a cultural heritage consultant. He was formerly the Director of the National Museum of Australia, and I know many of us were delighted to enjoy their hospitality last night. And he is presently the Chair of Blue Shield Australia, among many other governance roles. Matthew was elected as an Honorary Fellow of the Australian Academy of the Humanities in 2021, and he will argue that in order to build shared, sustaining cultural visions for the nation, we should turn to arts and cultural practitioners and organisations. Please welcome Matt.
Thanks, Esther. And can I just begin by offering my acknowledgements to the First Peoples, the First Nations of this place, the Ngunnawal, Noonawal, Ngambri peoples. And I'm fond of saying that I count my blessings that I've been welcomed since I've been here in the last 20 or so years, having come from Whadjuk Noongar country from the West Coast many years ago, and I'm eternally grateful for that continuing welcome. We've heard a fair bit about the lucky country being this, as Julian Schultz said yesterday, this hinge moment in the cultural apprehension of what the nation was. And Donald Horne himself wrote in 2004 that the lucky country came at a time of, quote, the greatest renovation of perceptions Australians had known. Much of the cultural change to come was anticipated in the 60s, foundation of the Australia Council a case in point, but the Whitlam years really saw this conscious melding of culture and national identity. There was government funding for a range of artistic and cultural domains, and a real flowering of the idea of culture in the nation. It was a time too when the building of the cultural fabric of nation through investments in major national institutions like the one that I formerly directed was really made manifest. Whitlam laid the foundation stone for the National Gallery of Australia and established committees of inquiry, importantly on the cultural heritage of nation, the report on the national estate known as the Hope Report and the Pigott Report on museums in Australia. The Hope Report really concerned itself with the preservation of heritage places, and its vision, though, was largely inspired by the environmental movement and the green bans that were a part of that moment in the 70s. Even by the measure of its own times, it was intensely Eurocentric. It really inadequately addressed the singular truth of this land, the astonishing and diverse human history of First Nations over more than 65,000 years. It's really greater focus was on this idea of the national estate, natural and built, that might foster and sustain our pride in nation. For its part, the Pigott Report was scathing of successive governments' failures, really, to look after the nation's cultural heritage. The committee with John Mulvaney and Geoffrey Blaney, it was better on reflecting on the cultural heritage of First Nations, calling for a gallery of Aboriginal Australia in Canberra as part of a new national museum. But like Hope, it made much of joining cultural ambitions and national identity. I just want to read you this quote. Virtually every nation has its national museum, but here the argument for a national museum is particularly powerful. For the nation covers a whole continent, and moreover, that continent, because of its long isolation from other land masses, has had an unusual natural history and human history. Now, this dream for national institutions that might vivify and sustain a distinctive and authentic culture based on Australian experience really seemed to satisfy our longing for national distinction in the 70s. And although Donald Horne didn't agree with all of Whitlam's agenda, he came really to value those investments in cultural nationalism as modernising forces that were carrying Australia forward. And in the end, of course, Donald Horne himself became increasingly involved in helping realise this vision for entwining culture and nation. What became of this nation-building vision for our cultural institutions? Well, let's fast forward to 2003, when I joined the National Museum of Australia, and I have to tell you, it was a time when it seemed like these dreams could get you into a lot of trouble. Far from underwriting a sense of national pride, the new National Museum infamously became the subject of scarifying criticism for its allegedly black armband view of nation. I'll remind you of some of the things that were said about it at the time. Columnist Miranda Devine decried the NMA's presentation of Australian history as one, quote, of sneering ridicule for white Australia. Angela Shanahan joined her in thinking it the worst case of white middle-class guilt. And that great protagonist of the culture wars, Keith Windschuttle, weighed in, describing it as a profound intellectual mistake as well as a great waste of public money. Now, I've heard people argue all this was ultimately positive, in that the history wars, the culture wars, at least demonstrated the extent to which history and culture mattered. But I have to tell you, the unforgiving nature of that rhetorical contest damaged people and careers and was strangely prescient of the kind of polar oppositions that we now see stand for public debate in our age of social media. Polarised, self-convinced, unforgiving. It's instructive to read the words of the review called into the National Museum amid all this invective in 2003. I'm just going to quote this section from it. It said that the museum should read more consensus and plurality at the core of the national collective conscience. It should, among other things, quote, present the fundamental themes and narratives of Australia since the arrival of the British through the building of the nation to the country's place in the contemporary world. This includes evoking national character traits, detailing exemplary individual, group and institutional achievements and charting the singular qualities of the nation. Well, I think these words were already anachronistic by the time of their publication in 2003. The plural truths of Australian life at the turn of the century meant that any kind of singular certainty about our past and our identity was already and properly problematic. But if it were unlikely then, in 2003, that we could contrive an authorised view of nation to be retailed generally, it's all but impossible now in 2024. Now, I say that knowing that the political class still has these dreams. Read the 2019 report of the Parliamentary Committee inquiring into Canberra institutions that urged them to develop, quote, a shared narrative that directly connects them with Australia's story. The desire to charge our public institutions with this responsibility of an authorised view of nation still burns deep, despite the world being wholly different from what it was even in 2003, 1975 or 1964. Now, we may envy aspects of Horne's audacious intellectual confidence in Lucky Country, but there's no real prospect of us winding the clock back. The intense social differentiation of the public realm, the fragmentary nature of public discussion, debate, and the deterministic nature of social media and other tech platforms militates against any idea that institutions like the National Museum might somehow be able to inspire us with a singular vision of nation and national meaning, let alone whether they should or not. The history wars, in their way, put paid to that, as did the turn to living digitally in all the years since. If we accept we can't simply return to the kind of cultural visions of those years, what are we left with? How can our cultural institutions imagine their service to the nation when they cannot simply nor usefully really define nation to us? Well, I don't pretend to have an easy answer for it, but I can tell you what we did at the National Museum through those years. In the first instance, without abrogating our legislative responsibilities, we started to think more about what we could do rather than what we had to say. We tried to turn ourselves inside out. We worked to establish, for instance, real co-creative programs with First Nations communities across the country that saw us sit down with curatoria of community people to find out what we could do together to represent their lives, their stories, their interests. We looked for opportunities to work in support of small regional local museums where we could to enable their work in story making. We funded musicians to create new work that would have a life in performance inside and outside the museum. One of those projects, Breathing Space, created 60 jobs for creatives in the course of the COVID pandemic. We found money for new work commissioned with Asiatopa, with AusAsia, two of our most significant Asian arts festivals. And we did a whole lot of low-tech things. We ran book clubs. We ran object clubs. We ran conservation classes for people who had collections of their own, even car clubs for classic car tragics like me. We held market days and public events of all kinds, frequently working with communities of difference to make them happen. We said yes to as many panels, symposia and public discussions as we could possibly manage. We put on concerts, searched for collaborations with artists, community groups and performers of all kinds. At one point, we even found ourselves running a bus service. Online, we created platforms for Australian history in schools and other online sites such as Momentous, enabling people to record and share their stories of living through the bushfires in 2020 and COVID. I like to think, I tell you this not to give a great roll call of all that the National Museum did well, but to demonstrate how I think it's true that we stepped outside the tramlines of our expected or conventional professional practice. We were doing, I think, what Graham Turner enjoined us to do yesterday. In the face of a declining media landscape and a failing political class, in our small corner of the world, we were doing it ourselves. And perhaps that's the answer for our cultural institutions. We need to look from these places about how we foster cultural work of all kinds. My sense is that we have never needed these places more than we do now. Not for what they tell us, but more for what they enable in our collective interest. strengthening our public culture, demonstrating the value of dialogue, allowing for the respectful contest of ideas and investing in creative and cultural enterprise. Now, some of this might sound like a return to the idea of the museum as forum, but I think of it as being more than that, really, to go beyond that. I like to think that we should expect our cultural institutions to act more like resource centres for our cultural lives, connecting artistic and cultural genres with ideas within a wider cultural ecology, one that joins arts and creative enterprise with the humanities, if you like. This animates an idea about the critical thing of these large public investments in culture being that they sustain the things that make us human: dialogue, debate, thought, creativity. Our public institutions can offer the ground upon which we might not only transact the diverse interests we have in the nation, but feel encouraged to think and act and do ourselves, to take part in the project. In my view, the greatest virtue they have is their considerable capacity to culturally enfranchise people across our communities. A deep commitment to the First Nations of this country, to the plural truths of our country, and a belief in the power of cultural practice to nourish our humanity gives these institutions real roles as brokers in a broader ecology that ranges across artistic and cultural genres and geographies. I'm using the term cultural ecology here, really misusing it in the way that anthropologists would like to use it, to think of it more loosely as a term that better acknowledges the linkages between production and consumption of art, creativity, ideas and other cultural artefacts, and undermines the conventions of that kind of linear flow between producers and consumers, or collapse the distinctions drawn between ideas, artistic genres and everyday life. It broadens, I think, our understanding of cultural and creative agents and their actions and motivations, and transcends the narrower, more instrumental language of cultural economy. And we've heard Justin talk about this earlier today. And lastly, it subverts conventional, vertically inspired models of governance and management in the cultural and creative sectors. For me, that term, cultural ecology, is that which embodies our conceptual and physical ways of being in the world, which are both produced by and reproduce the human parts of ourselves. In any respect, whether it's the making of art or the thinking of an idea, it's a creative act. All of us are implicated in this cultural ecology, in which we live and breathe, not just institutions, practitioners and other agents in the system. So I think when we think like this, it elides the difference really between cultural production and consumption. We all become implicated in the cultural ecology of our places, and so our decisions are all meaningful in terms of those cultural lives we want to sustain and promote. And this seems especially important now, precisely at a time when such transformational developments in digital and other technologies make us wonder what it means to be human. Ultimately, all of this is in the service of a kind of cultural democracy rather than cultural nationalism. It moves away from the content of nation, away from the old search for national identity and a national story. For me, today, the question is not so much what it means to be Australian, but what it means to be human. It's interesting that Donald Horne, after his time as chair of the Australia Council, turned to the community arts model and worked to see it fostered across the country. As we know, Donald Horne was able routinely to reinvent himself over a long life. So might we. For a long time, it seemed as if the nation wanted its investments in culture to tell us who we are. I hope instead they might help us to be all that we can be. Thank you.
Oh, thanks, Matt. Another invigorating presentation. And I do love that sense of redefining institutional practice to resource community knowledge and community action. I think that is such an important way of not just viewing institutions, but the ways in which we work with and enjoy our cultural institutions. Speaking of cultural institutions, Dr. Kim Williams is chair of the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. Among many other roles in arts and media leadership, Kim is a former CEO of News Corp Australia, Foxtel, Fox Studios Australia, the Australian Film Commission, Southern Star Entertainment and Music Aviva Australia, and former chair of the Australian Film Finance Corporation, the Sydney Symphony Orchestra and the Sydney Opera House Trust. Kim is going to argue that while policymakers and public institutions have their own specific roles to play, there are some particular public responsibilities that fall to all of us. Please welcome Kim Williams.
Culture is a public good, and the consequential duty of care in governments, institutions and on the part of the broad body of cultural workers provides complex discussion territory. So first up, I'll provide some working definitions to provide context. Culture offers simple or complex definitional territory. Simple first up, the customs, arts and social institutions and achievements of any particular nation, region, people or other social group. More complex definitions would wander into issues of language, creative aspiration, imagination, belief and production and consumption frameworks. We then move on to the related concept of identity. I see culture from the perspective of this session as being inextricable from some notion of identity, no matter how elusive that may be, as Matthew described. In Australia's case, identity might be seen in a contemporary landscape as being shaped by its Indigenous heritage, British colonial past and its diverse immigrant population. I'd offer the view that Australian identity might often be seen as associated with a love for the outdoors, sport, egalitarianism and a relaxed, laid-back attitude to social interaction. Sadly, regrettably, for this discussion and for policy that might emerge from it, Australian identity is rarely about imagination or creativity or conscious aspiration to excellence. We now move into the notion of culture as a public good. I take culture as a public good to refer to cultural activities in a range of disciplines, resources and institutions which provide value to the community as a whole and should be accessible to everyone. By treating culture as a public good, I imagine we would arrive at a view that sees societies making cultural investments to serve the well-being and cohesion of their communities, ensuring that cultural experiences are shared as widely as possible. In a policy sense, culture as a public good might be seen as having certain consistent themes. Non-exclusivity, where everyone should have access to the goods and experiences without being excluded on the basis of an ability to pay. Collective benefit, whereby the activities enrich society by promoting creativity, preserving heritage and fostering a sense of community and identity. Public funding, hopefully in these increasingly divided times, some measure of relevant subvention supported by government is axiomatic. And culture as a public good would be seen as contributing to the education and enlightenment of society, offering the opportunity for learning and personal growth. Needless to say, in our search for common ground and the establishment of working definitions, the discussion, there are myriad policy dilemmas that arise. To name but a few of those challenges that need to be confronted, there are the issues of funding allocations, the accessibility to experience versus the aspiration to the highest possible quality, which involves the whole balancing of the wobbly table dilemma in all contemporary policy. Policies need to address how to make culture inclusive without compromising its aspiration to excellence as core to the primary reason for funding it. The devil of measuring impact and reliably quantifying the benefits of cultural investments, often difficult, leading to embarrassingly simple-minded approaches. unlike economic returns, cultural benefits are invariably very hard to measure. Then the often vexed issue of cultural equity, addressing disparities in access and representation, is often very hard in terms of the wide spectrum of considerations involved. And increasingly, the intrusive private versus public in policy focus. While public funding, in my view, is essential, private investments and partnerships are said to have a very significant role, and private philanthropy can often involve matters of evasion from primary responsibility, conflicted judgment, and the imposition of values which restrict diversity of expansive views, as we have seen in many, many instances in recent years. Culture wars have to be raised as core to any considered discussion about the public good and cultural policy initiatives, but I think that Matthew covered that territory very well. Regrettably, these culture wars increasingly shape public policy unpredictably and influence the political landscape significantly, often in deleterious fashion. Which is probably a long-winded introduction to my central public policy concern, which attaches to the notion of how we all exercise our collective duty of care to culture as a common good. A couple of years ago, when I was preparing the inaugural Rod Wallace lecture for the Friends of the National Film and Sound Archive, I read a paper given by Justice Michelle Gordon of the High Court on the 70th anniversary of the judgment in the Communist Party case, where Justice Dixon, later a Chief Judge, as you all know, had described the rule of law as an assumption on which the Constitution was framed. Justice Gordon went on to observe that although the phrase rule of law was only used once in the 156 pages of the case report, the case has been hailed in other important judgments and by scholars as a celebrated victory for the rule of law, a powerful example of the rule of law at work, and even as the classic case protecting the rule of law in Australia. It prompted me to reflect on the status of duty of care on the part of parliaments and governments for the institutions created and funded under their aegis and the policy which follows from it, and which are respondents through their ministers to parliamentary scrutiny. It often would seem to me that the duty of care is, as Dixon said, an assumption, often, in my view, a profoundly unsafe one. Certainly there are regular mentions of duty of care in parliamentary handbooks. In fact, I found over 2,700 in reviewing the Parliament and Public Service website references. However, these all refer to regulatory and compliance policy, health and behavioural issues, and diverse legal issues touching such matters as immigration and human rights. What I would see as a fundamental duty of care for the many cultural institutions and policies created by the Parliament goes entirely unmentioned. And yet the health of the cultural fabric of our nation is dependent on that duty of care being observed diligently. And there are a wide range of cultural responsibilities of both a policy and institutional nature in the broad sweep of the Commonwealth's duty of care in the Parliament and then on to the remit of any one government of the day. Let's move to the ABC as Australia's largest cultural institution, a public good at work. I became the chair of the ABC back in early March of this year. I describe the role as being one which has to balance securing the integrity and independence of the ABC, offering custodianship in governance rigour to the ABC's affairs in many, many ways, policy curation as to strategic priorities and their execution, ensuring that it is a relevant, bold, contemporary and creative institution fit for purpose in today's world, and finally, advancing advocacy to ensure the ABC is nourished and resourced appropriately to meet the needs of the nation as Australia's largest cultural institution. The concept of the reality and the obligation of a duty of care is rarely distant from my mind. I am an ABC devotee and together with my board colleagues accept the challenge of committed custodianship with genuine enthusiasm and commitment. We all share that duty of care and we need to contemplate what that means in 2024. For the corporation to serve the nation well in this era dominated by dramatic change, it is imperative to develop an invigorated sense of purpose for contemporary application at the ABC, which is drawn from the Charter and the other core elements of the Act. The ABC, as I say, with predictable and determined regularity, is owned by all Australians. We need to reflect on that relationship often. It should be a core driver for all cultural institutions. The purpose and success of the ABC is only ever evidenced and measured in the quality, originality, diversity and consequence of its content and the proven connection with the wide multiplicity of Australian audiences it serves. Our diverse output in news and current affairs, children's, education, documentary, drama, varied light entertainment, performing arts, music, religion and all the other content genres is our sole reason for being. In an era where there is a veritable daily tsunami of non-Australian material threatening and eroding Australian values, accents and basic aspirations, there has never been a more important case for the role of the ABC. Our purpose is an avowed dedication to the national interest and the national future in ways which celebrate and interrogate Australia as the mirror, camera and microphone to the nation. Defined purpose and performance against it provides our reason for being. The ABC needs to deliver on the terms of the Charter and the duties of its board as to integrity and independence and news and information is ensuring that news and information is accurate and impartial. From those obligations, there are all the other elements contained in the Charter itself as to innovation, balance between mainstream and niche, contributing to a sense of national identity whilst informing and entertaining Australians, reflecting the cultural diversity of the Australian community and ensuring we deliver handsomely on specific cultural obligations to the arts and Australian creativity generally. In June, I said that the fight to defend democracy is a strong, coherent, shared national story. In the fight to defend democracy, a strong, coherent, shared national story is worth many battalions. The ABC, I believe, can be an important source of this stronger sense of national community and togetherness in a world where social media increasingly drives a sense of singularity, self-focus and isolation. In the hands of bad actors, it can drive a divisiveness of scary proportions and malintent relentlessly. Creativity is the crucible of our national future and imagination, and talent the vital ingredients. We need to nourish and nurture them as never before. Only then will we have the necessary vitality to achieve durable national policy outcomes. We all need to make the ABC, in so many ways a uniquely precious cultural institution, move confidently into the second quarter of this century with better focus on results, with clarity of purpose, ingenuity and courage, with the right decision incentives for distinctive creativity and good audience connections. Thank you. Speak your time.
He won. Thank you so much, Kim. And I really love that idea of a duty of care, but also that invigorating sense of creativity as being not just core to the national broadcaster, but as others have said, core to our key institutions. Now, no doubt you have got many questions for these four. The first question is just over there, the gentleman who is in the process of standing.
Hi, thanks to all the presenters. I'm Tony Bennett, linked with Western Sydney University and ANU. Really learned a lot from the presentations, but the issue that I want to raise is that I don't think we can deal with the role of culture as a public good, and especially not the role of publicly funded culture as a public good, unless we also take account of the respects in which it functions as a private good. I say this having been involved in a study with a number of people of patterns of participation in Australian culture, which shows that for all publicly funded cultural institutions, the ABC, the National Museum, the National Gallery, libraries, literary festivals, and so on, participation in these is markedly linked to whether you went to a private school as opposed to a public school, whether you're university educated, and if you're university educated, whether you're in a group of 8 university or in another university. It relates to your
Wrap it into a
professional
question.
class position. Sorry?
Wrap it into a question and then we can put it to the group.
I will do in a moment. So that is, it's not only that there are many advantages that accrue to participation in public institutions by virtue of the respect in which it functions as a private good, in the sense that it is a resource for social mobility, social advancement, and for the expression of class differences within Australia. So it also limits the degree to which publicly funded forms of culture can operate in a beneficial way with regard to the public issues that they address and deal with. And you can see that in terms of the distribution of votes for the referendum, for example. So the question I want to raise is, how can we deal adequately with culture as a public good unless we also address the ways in which it functions as a private good in ways that the state supports through the differential amounts of funding that it provides to private schools, religious schools, and different universities?
Right, now, in an enormous question, who would like to tackle that one? I think I'm looking at either Justin or Matt, because Justin's spoken very broadly about, and in other contexts, about a sort of class stratification of public good, but Matt in particular also looking at what is open and welcoming and constructive about our cultural institutions being for everyone. Would you like to go first, Justin?
Yeah, I mean, there's 2 different things in operation there. So public institutions aimed at a broad public, and how they, the questions about how they diversify their audience or extend participation, these are the usual buzzwords. And I would say, great, institutions have done a lot around that, but part of it actually goes back to, how people have the material means to live, in a increasingly unequal society, in a place where, there is this massive division between public schools and private schools. It's very hard for public institutions to do that. So that's a whole, how far can a public institution deal with social divisions? But in terms of this idea that how can public goods can also be private goods, I think it's a false opposition. I mean, part of that is, a kind of Bongiorno analysis, that, which reduces art and culture to a transaction, an individual transaction of social advancement. I think that line of thinking has just got us nowhere. We've done it, been it, we know it's not all perfectly good, but we need to look at that, but really turn back to the idea of, how people engage with culture in a much wider sense. And I actually also think that private goods, so-called private goods, goods that we, when we go to a concert, buy a book or a movie, they are private goods in the sense that we paid for them, but they are also public goods. They leak out, they're pirated, they go all over. They're part of a much broader conversation, and that's why we have to look after, if you like, the market bit of culture and how it can produce cultural goods as well as public goods. So I think it's a false opposition between public and private there.
Justin, thank you. Matt?
I think I'd agree with Justin about the need for greater nuance in understanding those interrelationships, and certainly also in understanding the highly differentiated audiences you actually have across a wealth of different kinds of public and, if you like, private goods in arts and culture. Of course, there are sodalities that have class reference in different areas of cultural production and consumption. Of course that exists. But some of them actually confound your expectations of these things. And I think last night I was speaking with someone who was talking to me about the way that people feel more comfortable visiting a museum or a gallery rather than visiting or attending the opera or classical music. It's Joanne, wasn't it? Yeah, thank you. No. and in a sense, it's pointing to this idea that there are different practices and protocols around cultural consumption, there is much a barrier to this as whether or not economically people are limited from access to culture. And this is something that the changes even, and we've discussed this in the course of this symposium, changes in educational levels across the population have actually changed patterns of cultural consumption as well over the last 40 or 50 years. I do think it's a more complex question. Of course, the great question that lies at the heart of this diversity inclusion is a chief preoccupation now, I think, for any thinking institution receiving public monies that feels that it has to discharge its responsibilities through engagement with broad publics.
A response from Jacqueline, then we have 2 questions from the audience.
I merely want to add also, and picking up on what Matt was saying, that culture here, the assumption is that it's really mainstream and fairly elitist, institutionalised culture. If you have a look at Diversity Art's most recent report, you'd actually find that I can't remember the stats and I'm really bad with numbers, but it was a significant portion of arts and cultural activities imagined very broadly to, festivals and library engagements, etc., and not just in the metropolis, but equally in more remote communities as well. Large take-up by diverse communities as well. And I would also mention, in terms of duty of care, etc., that it's in the field of arts, in fact, that you find more leadership opportunities for non-Anglo Australians in comparison to any other sector in Australia, education, for example.
Thank you all, and thank you, Professor Bennett, for the question. We have a question from Nicholas and then one from Joanne. So sorry, they're at the opposite ends of where the microphone is. Nicholas and then Joanne. Keeping him fit.
Thank you. I just want to draw on something that you said, Justin, towards the end of your speech in regards to the culture eaters, the global corporations, and what Kim referred to as the tsunami of content. And given that the public space where most Australians are engaging with culture is the digital one, how can we understand the rationale behind the trade-offs that Australia's made in free trade agreements that seem to prioritise modest economic gains such as lamb exports over cultural sovereignty? What are the implications of these agreements for the limitations on Australian music and television in broadcast and streaming, and how should Australia deliver on its duty of care to preserve space in the name of this public good?
That is a nice big question. Over to you, Justin.
Well, I'll say a little bit. I'm sure Kim has far more to say about this than me. For a start, those trade agreements, there is a convention, the 2005 Convention on Diversity of Cultural Expressions, which explicitly takes culture out of World Trade Organization restrictions. I mean, it's not necessary anymore because nobody cares about the World Trade Organizations. But, the idea that culture is bound as a commodity in a trade agreement, that's not necessarily legally binding unless the country wants it to be. I find it astonishing that a sovereign country could allow its culture, in that broadest sense, to be given over hand and foot to foreign corporations, if you like. That's not about autarky and we can produce everything here. When we say we're giving it over to global, it's a very, very small group of very powerful companies now that digital platform capitalism, or whatever you want to call it, has enabled. We're not talking about EMIs and Disney's too much now. It's actually bigger than that. So we really need to think about that. And of course, it's not just about content, streaming content. It's Ticketmaster. It's whole who owns the venue, who owns the publishing, all those kind of things. It really is a step up of how that's impacted. And I think using Kim's word, we need a duty of care to provide the possibility that Australians, whatever, can participate and produce culture and be able to share it. And that's a tall order, but we need to do it as a matter of urgency, I think.
Kim, did you want to add to that?
Well, I mean, the complexity of international treaties, as you know, is something that never contemplated the digital world that we live in today, because they were all determined before we were living in a world where the word digital has become redundant, because everything is digital now. It does run into a collision with many of these agreements, and it's a great dilemma, and I substantially agree with what Justin has just said. But the response, the duty of care, is to ensure that there is a really substantial quality Australian response that is provisioning Australian material, which has Australian values, Australian aspirations, Australian accents, Australian storytelling, has Australian perspectives, has Australian history at its core. And whilst the other arguments are arguments that must be had and must be vigorously engaged with, the primary argument is actually about backing that which makes this place anything other than a client cultural state, essentially, of the United States and Britain. Because all of the content that dominates the English-speaking world is American and British. You know, language is the greatest protector for every other country. There's a lot to be said for speaking Norwegian. Much virtue attaches to Spanish. We are vulnerable plunder, and it is being exploited predictably, pretty comprehensively. One might say ruthlessly. Yeah. This is the largest single territory per capita for all of those subscription platforms.
We have a question from Joanne,
like
and
stories.
then I'm either going to welcome or apologise to the last person who's got their hand up, because we might run out of time, but the question's from Joanne.
Thanks. Joanne Tompkins, University of Queensland. I'd like to pursue the idea of the duty of care, and specifically, Matt, with you. You called it reinvention rather than duty of care. How much were the sister institutions to the museum doing the same sort of, doing it for themselves, which is how you phrased it? And then a follow-up, how sustainable is it? Or perhaps I should ask, how did you rethink budgets and responsibilities to make it sustainable?
Sisters doing it for themselves. I love it, Joanne.
It's always dangerous.
Keep talking.
It's always dangerous to pass comment on other institutions in the Commonwealth, firmament. But of course, now I'm not the director of the National Museum anymore, so I feel uncommonly freer. The truth is that everybody does some of it. I think that we strongly tried to model in those years a particular view of ourselves as being a more open node within this kind of ecology that I'm describing. And just to, in a sense, connect to the last point, the action of these public investments is not just at that site and the use on that site, it's in the sense of relation that exists between that site, that node, the National Museum, and all the other actors and players, including publics, in that field. And that is what I mean about being very conscious of that in the leadership of those national institutions, or indeed in major public institutions of all kinds. It's the sense in which you understand the power and weight of this. You asked me also a question about how did you reorganise budgets. Well, I can say we did this at a time when we were complaining about there being no money in the National Museum. And that's my other point. It's very common for us, understandably, to look inside our organisations and say, we simply must have more. We're impecunious. We're having to let staff go. All these things are true. I was delighted last year when this government finally, after more than a decade of agitation about it, addressed the questions of the funding of the national institutions and made it sustainable again. For all that, these institutions in relative terms within the cultural ecology are well funded. Even when they don't think they are well funded, they are still big masses of capacity and resource. And that's what I mean about the idea of them being resource centre. So I think you have to take this into whatever your circumstances and use it as an organising principle for how you will think about the resources you have and not worry about those that you don't.
Kim's got that "I'd like to add something" facial expression. Kim.
I think that one needs to be very wary of saying it may be true in the instance of certain institutions that they are well funded and there is capability to actually apply the resource differently. But one has to be very guarded in making those sorts of observations, Matthew. Certainly in the case of the ABC, the decline in funding is of unusually ferociously severe proportions. In fact, the available resource to the ABC would see the ABC in the period from the passage from the Keating government to the Howard government, it has declined in real terms in today's dollars that would be spent on Australian content by $494 million. Now, it's not a trivial sum, and it is seen in a massive decrement in the capability, the competence and the quantity of quality Australian content that is distributed via audio and radio and television and video and in a range of technology initiatives. At the same time that the ABC has had to actually expand its diversity of distribution in order to actually maintain relevance to a wide variety of audiences. It's not trivial, and it must stop.
Extremely quick right of reply from Matt, because we're almost out of time.
Well, not so much a right of reply, but an opportunity to agree. I mean, clearly, what I'm saying, I'm not suggesting, as I didn't to the Minister when I was representing the interests of the National Museum to him over the past, varied ministers over the last decade, that clearly we needed more if we were going to survive. The question is this, though. At some point, you have to be aware of the weight of responsibility for what you do have. That's, I suppose, my point, Kim.
And that's absolutely
right. And it was brought home to me very clearly when I was speaking, actually, in a common interest that we have in the reference group for a new approach, the arts think tank. And Genevieve Lacey was talking in the midst of the COVID crisis about how desperate the circumstances were for musicians that were leaving Australian music, going off to do anything else but actually do the thing that made them great creative agents in our community. And precisely at that point, I found it impossible to suggest that I didn't have enough to be able to help. And it was at that point, I suppose, that one has to decide that, notwithstanding everything that Kim has very legitimately said, you have to feel the weight of what you do have, not the weight of what you would like to have.
Now, I must disappoint our final question asker because we have just gone over time. Before we thank everyone, I started by saying, sort of bringing that trilogy together of the cultural cringe, the Australian ugliness and the lucky country. And the more I've been thinking about this conversation, but also some of the conversations that we've been having throughout, there's another trilogy that comes to mind for me, which I think is really, even brings the economics in. And that's 3 books by George Megalogenis, Fault Lines, Race, Work and the Changing Face of Australia from 2003, The Australian Moment from 2012 and Australia's Second Chance from 2015, I think are really inspiring reading for a lot of the issues that we have been discussing these last few days. Please join me in thanking Justin O'Connor, Jacqueline Lowe, Matthew Trinker and Kim Williams. Thank you all very, very much.